The tent was cut open, not from the outside, from the inside. 9 people were sleeping in it, high on a mountain slope, in temperatures far below freezing. They had food, they had shelter, they had each other. And sometime during the night, they cut their way out and went into the snow. Their tracks led downhill toward the forest, away from the tent. Whatever they thought was happening, it was enough to make 9 experienced hikers choose the cold over the shelter built to keep them alive. These weren't people who wandered into the mountains without knowing the risks. So why did they leave? They were engineering students and young graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, and most of them had done this before. The route was Category 3, the highest difficulty level in the Soviet hiking system. This wasn't a group stumbling into the mountains without experience. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, had already led difficult winter expeditions. They knew the cold, they knew the terrain, they knew what happened when weather turned against you. On February 1st, 1959, the group was climbing Kholat Shakal, a mountain whose Mansi name is commonly translated as Dead Mountain, though even that translation is disputed. Conditions worsened as the day went on. Instead of continuing toward the forest, they stopped on the exposed slope and began cutting a platform into the snow. Then they pitched the tent. They laid skis beneath it. They anchored it against the wind. They climbed inside, and there was almost everything they needed for the night: sleeping bags, clothing, food, equipment. Outside was the cold. Inside was shelter. And yet, sometime later, all 9 people left. They didn't leave the mountain. They left the one place designed to keep them alive. And that's where the mystery begins. The tent was still there. The people weren't. Searchers found it on February 26th, partly buried in snow. Inside were backpacks, sleeping bags, food, equipment, clothing, most of what the group would have needed to survive. And much of their footwear was still there. That matters. Because outside the tent, investigators found a trail of roughly 8 or 9 sets of footprints leading downhill toward the forest. Some showed socks, some showed very little footwear at all. Why would experienced winter hikers step into that cold without properly dressing first? Then came the strangest detail. The tent had been cut. Forensic examination concluded that the cuts were made from inside the tent. More than one. Why cut through the fabric when there was already an entrance? Whatever happened, the group didn't simply pack up and leave. They left suddenly, and they left important things behind. Their sleeping bags stayed behind. Their food stayed behind. Much of their clothing stayed behind. The tent told investigators where they had been. It couldn't tell them why they left. The tracks led downhill. Then they disappeared near the forest. Searchers followed the trail and found the first signs of the group. A cedar tree, broken branches, and beneath it, the remains of a small fire. 2 of the 9 were found near that tree. They had made it to the forest. They had even managed to build a fire, but it hadn't saved them. Why? 3 more were found between the cedar and the tent. 5 accounted for, 4 still missing. The remaining 4 were found in May, deeper in the forest, in a ravine beneath the snow. And this is where the case became even harder to explain. Some of the bodies showed little obvious external trauma. Others had severe injuries, including major fractures. What caused them? They had left the tent alive. Now they were scattered across different parts of the mountain, 2 near a fire, 3 on the slope, 4 in the ravine. Somewhere between the tent and that ravine, something had happened. The evidence showed where they had gone. It still couldn't explain why. There's an obvious explanation: snow. The tent was pitched on an exposed slope. If a snow slab had shifted above or around the tent, the group might have believed the shelter was no longer safe. They might have cut their way out and moved downhill toward the trees without stopping to dress properly. That could explain the sudden departure. It could explain the clothing left behind, and it could explain why the tracks went toward the forest. For a moment, it fits, almost perfectly, but the 1959 searchers did not report obvious avalanche debris around the tent. So if a snow collapse drove them out, where was the evidence of it? The avalanche explanation is simple. It explains the decision to leave, but it doesn't automatically explain everything that happened afterward. And later, analyses have disagreed over exactly what kind of snow movement could have occurred there. Maybe the mountain drove them out, but if it did, what exactly happened after they left? Maybe the mountain didn't move. Maybe the air did. The tent sat exposed on an open slope with little to break the wind coming off higher terrain. Powerful downslope winds can build quickly in mountain terrain. Could that have made the slope feel dangerous enough to trigger a sudden decision? There's another possibility tied to extreme wind. Under certain conditions, wind interacting with mountain terrain can produce very low-frequency sound. Some researchers have suggested that this kind of sound might contribute to a feeling of unease, but there's no evidence that the group actually experienced it, so it's a possibility, not an answer. And even if an environmental threat pushed them out, another problem remains. It doesn't explain the fire at the Cedar. It doesn't explain why the bodies ended up in different places, and it doesn't by itself explain the severe injuries. Wind might explain why they left. It doesn't explain what happened once they were outside. So maybe the question isn't only, what did the mountain do? Maybe it's, what did they think was happening? Maybe they weren't running from the mountain. Maybe they were running from someone. It's the explanation that comes to mind almost instantly. 9 people don't cut their way out of a tent and abandon their belongings in freezing temperatures for no reason. Something made them leave, and something can mean someone. Investigators had to consider it. The sudden departure, the tent left behind, the tracks leading away from the shelter. The region wasn't empty. The Mansi, an indigenous people native to the area, lived and hunted across parts of the Urals, but living near a place isn't evidence of an attack. So investigators looked for what an attack should leave behind. Signs of a struggle, evidence of another group, a trail showing that someone else had been there. They didn't find evidence that established an attack. The tracks leading away from the tent were consistent with the group leaving. There was no clear trail proving another group had approached, and there were no clear signs of a struggle at the tent. The injuries didn't settle it either. Severe injuries can have more than one possible cause. On their own, they don't prove an attacker was there. It's the explanation people instinctively reach for, but the evidence never gave investigators enough to prove it. An attacker could explain the sudden departure, but no attacker was found. And that leaves the same question. If it wasn't an attacker, and no single environmental explanation accounts for everything, what could have made 9 experienced hikers leave their shelter that night? We know where they were. We know where they went. We still don't know exactly what made them leave. The tent was cut from the inside. Much of their warm clothing and footwear stayed behind. Their tracks led downhill. A fire was built beneath a cedar tree, and the bodies were eventually found in different places, some with little visible trauma, others with severe injuries whose exact causes remain disputed. A snow collapse could explain the sudden departure. An environmental threat could explain the decision to move downhill. A human attacker could offer another explanation. But none of those possibilities by itself gives us a complete picture. And that leaves the real question, the one underneath all the others. Whatever they believed was happening that night, it was serious enough to make 9 people who understood cold, who understood mountains, and who understood exactly how dangerous that weather was, choose the snow over their shelter. The tent survived. Their belongings survived. The evidence survived. The one thing that could explain why they left didn't? What did those 9 people know that we never will?